First chapter of Ezra, and we saw that the events recorded in this book took place during the reign of King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes as the Greeks called him, and this was at the height of the Persian Empire. The empire spread from the borders of Greece to Egypt and then stretched all the way eastward to India. But the king was not content. He wanted to conquer parts of Greece. And chapter 1 probably took place shortly before his unsuccessful campaign to conquer Greece. From the biblical account and from secular history, we see a picture of a powerful and vain king who was given to fits of rage. We talked about one time where there's a record that he commanded his men to beat the water with whips because he was angry with the storm that interrupted his plans. This story of Esther is set in Susa, one of the citadel or capital cities of the Persian Empire. And at that time, the king was giving a long banquet that lasted for 180 days. And during this time, Ahasuerus showed off his wealth, his palace, and the strength of his army, his might, to his generals, to his governors, to nobles, and to anyone else who was in attendance. Well, at the end of that 180-day period, almost 6 months, he proclaimed a lavish 7-day feast, during which time there was no restriction on consuming the royal wine. And after 7 days of this drunken festival, Ahasuerus decided there was one more thing he wanted to show off to his guests. So he ordered his queen, who was named Vashti, to appear before the guests so they could gaze upon her beauty. We don't know for sure what all this request entailed, but it was probably an indecent proposal on his part. Well, Queen Vashti refused the king's command. The king and his advisors were upset that word of this rebellion would get out and create problems throughout the kingdom. So the king's advisors convinced him to banish Vashti so that she would never appear before him again. And they also advised that her position be given to another woman. This would send a clear message to any women in the kingdom who thought they could get away with not honoring their husbands. Well, all these actions were actually not just the actions of men, but they were God moving in the hearts of people to accomplish his will. He was clearing the way for the rise of Esther. We also know that Esther is different from other Bible books. It's not quoted in other New Testament books. We haven't found any portion of it in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are a lot of things missing in Esther that we would expect to see in other Bible books. There's no mention of the law or sacrifices or offerings, no mention of the temple or miracles or worship, no mention of faith or prophecy or heaven or hell or prayer. And finally, the book of God doesn't even mention God. The book of Esther doesn't even mention God. And then we said the theme of Esther is the providence of God. And even though God is not mentioned, he's clearly in control of the events that are being retold to us. God uses ordinary events to produce extraordinary results. J. Vernon McGee said, "Providence is the hand of God in the glove of history." Well, tonight, the story moves on. Vashti's been deposed. Some years have intervened, and now the search is on to find a new queen to replace Vashti. So let's read this together. We're in Esther 2. We're going to cover the first 18 verses. And as always, if you want to note down any important words or phrases, we'll talk about those when I'm done reading it. So Esther chapter 2. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the citadel, under custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This pleased the king, and he did so. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. Now when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Haggai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. And the young women pleased him, and won his favor. And he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. Now when the turn came for each young woman to go into King Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with spices and ointments for the women. When the young woman went in to the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go in to the king again unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, to go in to the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. Okay, so what stood out to you as some important words there in that passage?
My dictionary says beautiful girls. Does it say in your version of the Bible?
Beautiful girl. It does say virgins, yep. We'll talk about that a little bit.
Unification.
Or beauty treatments, the same as beautification.
For what was it for?
Beauty treatment.
Oh, beauty treatments. Yep.
For 7 months.
Yeah, a lot of emphasis on beauty here, right? On outward beauty, let's say. Yeah.
I can't imagine what they would be doing for 7 months.
What?
I can't imagine what that must have entailed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Esther was winning favor
Yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit. That's really important. Okay, that's good. We'll start with those. Well, you can see that I had a little fun with the title of this lesson. Those of us who are of a certain age remember the annual Miss America pageant. And at the end of the pageant, the host of the pageant was a guy named Bert Parks, and he would sing the theme song. He would sing, "There she is, Miss America." And so I thought, well, we'll do a little takeoff on that for our study tonight, because there's some pageant aspects to this. In that pageant, one young woman from each state in the United States was chosen to represent her home state, and she went to the pageant with the hope of being crowned Miss America. Well, tonight we read of a kingdom-wide search for a new queen, but it's anything but innocent and wholesome like the Miss America pageant was. Verse 1 starts with the words, "after these things." Well, what things are we talking about here? Well, first of all, we're talking about the events in chapter 1, the drunken banquets and the rebellious choice of Vashti that we saw in chapter 1. But this expression suggests that there's a passing of time. The first chapter took place, it tells us, in the 3rd year of King Ahasuerus' reign. And then in verse 16, in the 2nd chapter, it tells us that Esther went into the king's chamber in the 7th year of his reign. So there's a 4-year time gap, but we also know that these women had a 12-month preparation, this beautification period that some of you mentioned. So as we open up here in chapter 2, we're probably about 3 years after the events of chapter 1. And we think that probably this was the time when the king was off on his campaign to conquer Greece. And as we said last week, it was successful in the beginning, but ended up where he had to head home after a lot of his navy was destroyed in a storm, and his troops had taken a beating. So he's coming back, in a sense, with his tail between his legs. He's returning to his palace, his kingdom in Susa, and that's kind of where we pick up in chapter 2. Well, it says that Ahasuerus remembered 3 things. First, he remembered Vashti. Chuck Swindoll suggests that Ahasuerus longed for someone to greet him and warmly welcome him on his return home from battle. He was maybe looking for words of comfort and understanding after his battles. It says that his anger had subsided, and he remembered his former queen's beauty and the comfort she had provided him. Well, and secondly, he remembered what she had done. He remembered how she had refused his call, that disobedience that she had displayed at the time of the banquet when she refused to appear. And thirdly, he remembered the decree his advisors encouraged him to issue. Vashti was deposed as queen and never again appeared before the king. There seems through these words to be sort of a longing on the king's part. But remember one little detail we were given in chapter 1. The decree could not be revoked. And that becomes important here. If the decree had been reversed, if that was possible, it kind of sounds like maybe Ahasuerus would have reversed it. He's kind of longing for the good old days here. And if that decree had been reversed, then the rest of the events in this chapter regarding Esther wouldn't have happened. There would not have been a need to search for a new queen. So here again, we see God at work even in some of these small details of the laws of the land of Persia. Well, the king's advisors came up with this great plan. They said, let's have a Miss Persia contest. We're going to bring in beautiful virgins from all over the kingdom. The word for virgin here can be generically used to mean young women of marrying age, but I think probably the sense that we have of virgin as a young woman who had not had sexual relations is probably more appropriate in what we're talking about. So the king would order overseers to gather beautiful young women and bring them to Susa. They would be put in the king's harem and given beauty treatments to enhance their looks. And so this was sure to appeal to the king, so the advisors knew that they were on the right track. Well, of course, it did appeal to the king. It pleased him very much. And that was the sum total of his moral judgment here. It pleased him. No other thought is given to this plan and the effects it might have on other people. And so here we have this other dark side of this story. He would be the only judge in this Miss Persia pageant. He would spend a night with each of the young women and decide which one pleased him most. Vashti was removed for her disobedience, and the king decreed that her position be given to someone more worthy. But when the king looked for a replacement, there was no real measurement of worthiness. The only requirements were that she was young, beautiful, and a virgin. So King Ahasuerus ordered that the search begin. But let's consider the broader picture of what's happening here. The women were taken from their homes, and they were brought into the king's harem. They would spend the rest of their lives in the harem. They would have their one opportunity for one night with the king, and he's not going to select more than one, so the rest of them are living in the harem. They're never going to have the opportunity to marry or have that kind of a life outside the palace. They belong to the king at that point. So this isn't a kind of a romantic Beauty and the Beast story or anything like that. It's a lustful king taking advantage of young women in his kingdom. Now, in our time, being in the Miss America pageant can be a springboard to a bright future, even for those who don't win the pageant. Non-winners have gone on to be famous actresses and newscasters and politicians and business executives. But the young women selected in this Miss Persia pageant competition faced a life isolated in the king's harem. Well, in verse 5, we get introduced to the next major player in the story, and that's Mordecai. It simply tells us that Mordecai was a Jew in Susa. Now, the English word Jew in our Bibles here is translated from the Hebrew word Yehudi. And originally it was used to describe Israelites who remained in Judah or were from the tribe of Judah during and after the Babylonian captivity. The first time the word appears is in 2 Kings 16:6, where the king of Syria drove the men from Judah, or out of Judah, into Elam. It also appears in 2 Kings 25:24-25. Somebody has that.
Gedaliah took out to reassure them and their men. Do not be afraid of the Babylonian officials, he said. Settle down to the land and serve the king of Babylon. It will go well with you. The second month, however, Ismail, son of Nethaniah, the son of Elishama, who was of royal blood, came with 10 men and assassinated Gedaliah, but also the man of Judah, and the Babylonians who were with him at Mizpah.
So that phrase there, the men of Judah, is really the same word, Yehudi, and this is one of the early times that we see that mentioned. So before that, when the Old Testament talks about God's people, it refers to them as Israelites or children of Israel. And so here's the first time we see this move toward Yehudi, and then eventually that term Jews comes out of that, and it becomes used for all Hebrews or children of Israel, and we see a lot of that in Jesus' time as well. Well, it tells us that Mordecai lived in Susa. Now note that he did not go back to Jerusalem when Cyrus issued the decree to return. The Bible doesn't pass judgment here, it just merely records the fact that Mordecai was in Susa. Now there's some confusion about the ancestors that are listed in verse 5. Some read these words to mean that Mordecai was among the captives carried away to Babylon with King Jeconiah. But I don't think that's right, because if that's the case, then Mordecai would be about 120 years old at that point. So that doesn't fit. So while the wording is a little unclear, I think it's telling us that Mordecai is an ancestor of this Kish, and it relates to Shimei, who was the son of Kish, and he was the one that was taken into captivity. Now also note that Mordecai is a pagan name, and it reflects the Babylonian god Marduk. Mordecai may have had a Hebrew name, But the text doesn't tell us about that. All we're given is this more Chaldean or maybe Persian name. We are given the Hebrew name of his young cousin. It was Hadassah. Her name means myrtle or myrtle tree. The myrtle tree has a sweet smell, but a bitter taste. And it's just interesting as a side note that the fragrance of the myrtle is released when the leaves are crushed.
Leads to corruption.
Are crushed,
Oh,
smashed.
sweet smell.
Yeah. When we studied Ezra, there was a point where God sent the prophets Haggai and Zechariah to encourage the returning exiles to resume work on the temple. And in Zechariah's first vision, one of the horsemen that's described in that vision, who had been sent to patrol the earth, was standing among the myrtle trees. Let's read about that in Zechariah 1, 7 to 11.
On the 24th day of the 11th month, which is the month Shevat, in the second year of Darius, the word of the Lord came to Zechariah the prophet, the son of Berechiah, the son of Iddo, as follows. I saw at night, and behold, a man was riding on a red horse, and he was standing among the myrtle trees which were in the ravine, with red, sorrel, and white horses behind him. Then I said, My Lord, what are these? And the angel who was speaking with me said to me, I will show you what these are. And the man who was standing among the myrtle trees answered and said, These are those whom the Lord has sent to patrol the earth. So they answered the angel of the Lord who was standing among the myrtle trees and said, We have patrolled the earth, and behold, all the earth is peaceful and quiet.
So in that vision of Zechariah, the myrtle trees were in a low place, symbolizing humility, but God was in their midst. The Talmud considers myrtles as a symbol of righteousness. So we have some of this symbolism behind the name of Hadassah. But we learn that Hadassah also had a Persian name, and that was Esther. And Esther means star. So young Esther was an orphan, it tells us. When her parents died, her cousin Mordecai adopted her as his own daughter. Verse 7 doesn't mince words. It says, she had a beautiful figure and was pleasant to look at. Now it's interesting, we've heard descriptions like this before. We see a description of this, of Rebecca, very similar to this. Somebody has Genesis 26, 6 and 7.
So as it said in your law, when the men of the place asked him about his wife, he said, She's my sister. For he feared to say my wife, thinking lest the men of the place should kill me because of Rebecca, because she was attractive in appearance.
Rebecca was attractive in appearance, and so Isaac didn't want to let the other king know that she was his wife, fearing that she might take her and do something bad to him. And we see a similar description also of Rachel in Genesis 29, 16 through 20.
Now Laban had two daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were weak, but Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance. Jacob loved Rachel, and he said, I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel. Laban said, It is better that I give her to you than that I should give her to any other man. Stay with me. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and then seemed to him but a few days because of his love that he had for her.
So the Bible does describe a number of women as being beautiful, and Esther is one of them. She was beautiful in figure and pleasant to look at. We'll learn later as the story unfolds that she was beautiful in character as well. Well, in verse 8 we read, the king proclaimed his edict, and many young, beautiful women were gathered into the king's harem in Susa. Now, we learned in the first chapter that there were 127 provinces throughout the Persian Empire. Now, we're not given the math here or exactly how this rolled out, but the word did go out to all the provinces, so maybe there was one representative from every province, or maybe some sent 10, we don't really know. There are a lot of women involved here in this Miss Persia pageant. But note that here's we come to another part of the story that's kind of difficult to understand in many ways. The law clearly stated that a Jew should not marry a pagan Gentile. We read that in Deuteronomy 7, 1 through 4, whoever has that.
When the Lord your God brings you into the land where you are entering to possess it, and clears away many nations before you, the Hittites and the Girgashites and the Amalekites and the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and stronger than you. And when the Lord your God delivers them before you, and you defeat them, then you shall utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them, and show no favor to them. Furthermore, you shall not intermarry with them. You shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor shall they take their daughters for your sons. For they will turn your sons from following me to serve other gods, and the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will quickly destroy you.
So that law was given before the people entered the land, but the law also said that they shouldn't have sexual relations with a man who was not her husband. We'll know this familiar verse, Exodus 20:14.
You shall not commit adultery.
Thank you. And also, they were commanded that they should not eat unclean food. And we see this in Leviticus 11, 46 and 47.
There is a law, this is the law regarding the animal and the bird, and every living thing that moves on the waters, and everything that swarms on the earth, to make a distinction between the unclean and the clean, and between the edible creature and the creature which is not to be eaten.
So, don't marry a pagan Gentile. Don't have relations with someone who's not your husband. Don't eat unclean food. Now, Esther's about to do all 3 of these things. Now, we can't say for certain whether she had a choice in the matter. That's not really made clear, and some commentators argue that this was forced upon her and upon Mordecai, but it really isn't clear whether she had a choice or not, whether she could have escaped this search for the queen. But clearly, she was violating the law on these points. So we'll tuck that away and come back to that later. Charles Spurgeon said, "We cannot commend Mordecai for putting his adopted daughter in competition for the monarch's choice. It was contrary to the law of God and dangerous to her soul in the highest degree." And as we read the scriptures, they neither excuse nor applaud Mordecai for this. Well, when Esther arrives at the palace, she was placed under the authority of this man named Haggai. He was the head of women. He was the headmaster of the harem, if you will. And it tells us that Esther found favor in his sight. This repeats a pattern that we've seen of God working in the lives of people who are in unlikely circumstances. We read a similar thing about Joseph in Genesis 39, 1 through 4.
Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had brought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight, and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house, and put him in charge of all that he had.
So Joseph finds favor in the sight of those who are his overlords. We read something similar to that in the book of Daniel as well, Daniel 1, 8 and 9.
But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials.
So we've seen that whether in prison or in service to an ungodly king, God blessed and provided for his servants. Haggai showed Esther favor by giving her cosmetics, food, 7 prime maids to serve her, and elevated her to the best position in the harem. This may have had something to do with her eventually winning the Miss Persia contest and becoming queen, but ultimately it's another indication of God's unseen hand at work in this story. But Esther was holding back a secret, and she was doing it in obedience to Mordecai, her cousin. She did not tell anyone that she was a Jewess. We're not given a reason here, but we find some clues from around the same time period in Ezra 4, 1 through 6. Again, happening at about the same time. We get a picture of some of the attitudes there. So who has Ezra 4, 1 through 6?
Now, when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple to the Lord, the God of Israel, they approached the river well and the heads of fathers' houses and said to them, "Let us build with you, for we worship your God as you do, and we have been sacrificing to him ever since the days of Esther, king of Assyria, who brought us here." But Zerubbabel, Joshua, and the rest of the heads of fathers' houses in Israel said to them, "You have nothing to do with us in building a house to our God, but we alone will build to the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us." Then the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah and made them afraid to build.
So if you remember at that time from our study in Ezra that there was a lot of opposition to the Jews trying to rebuild the temple. They tried to bribe them, they tried to sweet talk them, they tried to infiltrate the work. They took a number of different actions to try to get in there. So there was a lot of opposition to the Jews. Their enemies were opposing this rebuilding of the temple. And then they also, in the end, wrote accusations against the Jews to the king. So there was this kind of atmosphere throughout the kingdom. And maybe that's some of the reason for Mordecai encouraging Esther to be silent. We don't know for sure. Now, Mordecai thought that it was better to conceal the fact for the time being. He did his best to keep an eye on his young cousin. He walked past the court of women every day to inquire of her well-being and note any of the developments that occurred. The Septuagint translate this term, I think, that we have here, to learn about her well-being. That idea of learning. In the Greek Septuagint translation, it uses the Greek word episkopeo. And as we see in the New Testament, episkopeo is one of the responsibilities of church elders. We see this in 1 Peter 5, 1 and 2.
What does episcopeo mean?
Yeah. Let's hit that. Who has that verse?
I got it.
Yeah.
The elders which are among you, I exhort, who am I also an elder, and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and also a partaker of the glory that shall be revealed. Feed the flock of God which is among you, taking the oversight thereof, not by constraint, but willingly, not for filthy lucre, but of ready mind.
So here that word episkopeo was the oversight idea. It has the idea of a careful inspection with the sense of expecting responsibility for the care of somebody else. So we can see that is a responsibility of an elder today in the church, and that was the kind of behavior that Mordecai was exhibiting over his younger cousin Esther. He was making inspection of the situation she was in. He was taking some responsibility as much as he could on the outside to watch over her and care for her. So as the elders of the church have watched care over the church, so Mordecai watched over the well-being of the young Hadassah. Well, each of the candidates received 12 months of spa treatments. The first 6 months were treatments of myrrh oil. This is an expensive perfume. Remember, it was one of the gifts that the Magi brought to the Christ child. And we also read in the Gospels that this was one of the spices that Nicodemus used as he laid Jesus' body in the tomb. So in the ancient world, it was frequently used as an expensive perfume. So that was the first 6 months. Then the next 6 months we read that there were spices and other cosmetics that these girls received. Outward beauty was of paramount importance in the Persian court. And each of the candidates was to look their best for their big night with the king. Well, the young women could take anything with them from the harem when they went in to see the king for their night. They selected whatever clothing or jewelry or cosmetics they felt would enhance their chances of pleasing the king. They would go into the king in the evening and be returned to the harem in the morning. They would then wait and hope the king would have enjoyed himself enough to call them back. If he did not summon them again, they were not free to leave. They would remain as another concubine to the king. Well, when Esther's turn comes, she takes only what Hegai recommends. He's shown her favor, and she trusts his experience. So part of this favor that he's shown her is to give her good advice. She kind of knows the ins and outs. He knows the king after all these years. So he kind of coaches her, if you will, on what to bring. Again, no details of what that was, but he coached her on what to take into the king. Now, we're familiar with the verse later in Esther where Mordecai encourages Esther by telling her that she may have been born for such a time as this. Most famous verse in Esther. But I think there's another verse here. The end of verse 15, I think, is also remarkable. It says, "Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her." Now, can you imagine that? How does one do that in that situation? It was pagan and very competitive. Probably would say cutthroat. It must have been ruthless. And there was only one winner among all these women. And if you won the Miss Persia contest, you had it made as the new queen. But if you lost out, you were condemned to life as just another of the king's concubines who may or may not ever see the king again. So the pressure and the backbiting must have been just off the charts. And yet, somehow, Esther was able to find favor in the sight of all. Here again, God's hand is at work in this detail of the story as well. Well, it tells us that Esther also found favor and kindness with the king. He selected her to be his new queen. The king was seeking sexual satisfaction and personal comfort and political stability, but God was positioning Esther in the palace for the preservation of his covenant people. To celebrate, the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. Seems to be the way the king likes to do, is throw big parties. But this, it says, was Esther's feast. And it was the public recognition of her as the queen. So then it says that the king also did something else very interesting. He proclaimed a tax moratorium and generously gave gifts. A government proclaiming a tax moratorium. That's a great idea. So the king was definitely in a good mood at this point. He does not call on the beautiful Esther to show off her beauty in front of his guests as he did in the previous banquet. So maybe he's learned something from that earlier banquet. Well, as we wrap up the night, I want to make a few more observations in closing here, and these are applicable to our lesson tonight, but I also think they apply to the whole book of Esther. This is a very familiar story to us. There have been a lot of dramatic recreations of the story in film and on stage. There's a well-done musical version of it. But often these recreations, and sometimes even Esther Bible studies we may have attended, leave us coming away with kind of this overall impression that this is some kind of a holy Cinderella story. A poor young Jewish girl is elevated to the position of queen. She takes a courageous stand. She intercedes on behalf of her people, and the entire Jewish people are saved. Well, those things are true, but there's so much more going on here in this story. That view kind of glosses over some of the details. The true story is a lot more complex and frankly, a lot grittier. We see people acting nobly, and we see them acting selfishly. This whole scenario is very secular and evil, this contest to bring women in. The characters are imperfect, just like you and I are imperfect. Mordecai sits at the king's gate, which suggests that he has some position and is relatively well off. So has Esther really grown up in poverty? Is she poor Esther? I think probably not. I think probably she's had some comfort, perhaps even some luxury, because of Mordecai's position. The king, for his part, he's arrogant, he's vain, and he's lustful. Mordecai shows great love and compassion for his orphan cousin by taking her into the household, but then later he makes no attempt to stop her or protect her from getting snatched up in the king's evil plan to take advantage of young women to satisfy his own desires. So Esther also walks into this evil situation. We learn later she's hesitant to speak up to the king, but then eventually she displays great wisdom and courage that results in the preservation of the entire Jewish race. So the thing that runs through all these contradictions and a lot of the questions that remain unanswered for us in the text is the providence of God. The unmentioned God is everywhere. He's using evil situations. He's using people making loving, honorable decisions, and people making poor choices, all together to accomplish his will. Nothing is outside his reach. And if we don't see that, we either romanticize this story or we just simply feel that it's about the bad guys getting what they deserve and the good guys winning in the end. So Esther shows us that God has not abandoned his people. Esther shows us that God is not constrained by the evil plans of men, nor is his will diverted. Chuck Swindoll had some great comments on this book. He said, God's plans are not hindered when the events of the world are carnal and secular. He is not limited to working in the Christian family. Those involved may not be glorifying him, but never doubt it, he's present. And that's a great summary of what we see in Esther. Well, as I mentioned before, there are a number of great art pieces in Esther, so I'll share a couple of them with you tonight. Last week we saw this one. This was Queen Vashti, and remember we saw on that back counter there is her crown, so she's been deposed, if you will, and set aside. The same artist, Edwin Long, has a companion painting, and they're often described together, and this is a painting of Queen Esther. And actually, he painted the one of Esther before he painted the one of Vashti about a year before. And one thing I want you to notice here is, if you'll take a look in the painting of Queen Vashti, if you notice the servant girl here in the lower right, and you compare her face, so in his view, he's taken Esther here, and now Esther becomes queen in the other painting. So a little bit of poetic license there, but he makes that connection between Vashti and Esther. Well, another famous painting of Esther, this is called A Jewish Heroine from the Hebrew Bible. It's a Rembrandt. We think he probably has Esther in mind here. And you see kind of the use of the shadows and the light in typical Rembrandt style.
That's not how I would see Esther.
Yes, it's very Rubenesque.
Well, it is Rubenesque as well. Even this is Rembrandt, but there is Rubenesque as well. Yes. Obviously, we've seen this before, right? These guys paint what they know, and what they know is somebody in their century in Europe dressed like that. So that's what they do.
Steve, I could be wrong, but history says that in those old times, the beauty of a woman is that if she has more weight, more chubby, and more warmth. That's where the old days. Yes. But anyway, the first picture is that woman is really very, is exquisite and resplendent.
Yeah,
The first picture.
yeah, yeah. There's another picture I didn't show. You can look it up. It's in the Louvre. There's some nudity in it, but it emphasizes her great figure and her beauty, which the Bible talks about. And then this is by the Dutch painter De Gelder, and he was actually one of Rembrandt's last students. And so, I'll zoom on this a little bit. Here is Esther, and that stole around her is ermine, which is a symbol of royalty, and so that's De Gelder's way of emphasizing it.
Young and gorgeous.
Yeah. And then there's one more, a little more modern take on this, but it's interesting. This is by Salvador Dali, and it's titled Ahasuerus Falls in Love with Esther. And it's interesting. You see, he's trying to communicate here to us that here's the king has fallen in love with the beautiful young Esther, and she occupies his thoughts. And he sees her everywhere, and he can think of nothing else. So kind of an interesting way to communicate that. Yeah, yeah. Okay. So, as you wrap up tonight, a couple of questions for some discussion here. What do we see about God? What do we learn about God and his characteristics tonight?
He works in everything in history, and not just Christian people, but he's working all things for good.
Yeah.
In all these characters. And then, what's his name? What's the bad guy?
Haman?
Haman.
Yeah, we'll see. Yep.
Haman.
He's not obscured in any human condition, right?
Mm.
And I think that, especially today, we're so factionalized based on what we think is the right or the left, or dark or bad, and mild and thought of it. In actuality, if you have patience and you have faith, you'll also know that he's also present in what we consider to be evil or dark or nefarious in nature. When we talk about even politics or countries, right?
Mm.
And it's just interesting that, I mean, as mad as it and as insidious as like a pageant is, right? And all of its gallantry, it's like he's there, and we just have to remember that.
Yeah.
I like what you quoted about God's not being constrained.
Yeah, go ahead, Gabe.
I've learned that God utilizes various names to accomplish his goal.
Yeah.
One person or a couple of persons.
Yeah.
There's anything that will hinder him from achieving his goal. Would it be for one person who has prayed a lot, never been answered, but in time, no matter what the situation is, if it's his will, then it's will be done.
Yeah, yeah. Not that we use this as an excuse to not pursue holiness or not pursue righteousness, but it's also encouraging to know that we don't have to achieve a certain point before God can use us. I mean, if God can use these pagan kings and some of these horrible evil practices, right, he can use anything.
And I think you bring up a good point, is that even in the most like horrific instances that we are subject to, we see on the news, or oh, that happened to this person, or that there is some sort of divine elegance to it all, in the sense that it's not for naught. We always have to remember that. And it's nothing is ever, I think in the story of it all is in vain. And I think that's how I can, temper my anger or even my horror at some of the things we do to one another as humans. Is to know that there is something, even in that instance of darkness, there's a light.
I think it's interesting too that God is very much about beauty. It kind of gets manifested here in a more physical way, but we'll see as we go on. There are other aspects of that too. God is beautiful. He's very much about beauty of our souls. Okay, and then if you've got a quickie here, great. Otherwise, this can be kind of a takeaway for you to think about over the week. Can you look back over your life at what you maybe thought were coincidences? And now as you look back, you recognize the hand of God at work. And I say this because I think sometimes we kind of stumble through life and we don't connect those dots. We may not want to admit it, but we think that things just happened or events just rolled out in a certain way. Excuse me, but they're not coincidences. They're the hand of God at work in our lives, just as we see God's hand at work in some of these minor details in this story of Esther.
I think, in my opinion, there are no such thing as coincidences.
Yeah.
Because God allows things to happen, whether they're small or big things.
Yeah.
What we consider small or big is God's doing. So I don't believe in coincidences or luck.
Yeah. I think he wants us to recognize that, at the time too, and give him glory for that rather than slide over it.
I was told to two guys, and they said that they made a hole in them, and they both said, oh, it was luck. And I was amazed coming from a Christian.
Yeah.
No such thing as luck. But if you're saying that as a Christian, then I don't know what to say. I just kept quiet.
Any final comments?
I agree, there's no such thing as luck or coincidence for Christians. God is in control of everything.
Although I use the word coincidence to indicate something that happened simultaneously that wasn't expected. So it doesn't mean I believe in it like it's a luck. It's a difference.
I think you gotta be careful of how much you ascribe to just divinity, right? I mean, there's certain, just that things happen, right? I think there's that statement, like coincidence versus like, oh, like, it was meant to be. It's a slippery slope. To just know that, have faith. It may or may not be, but God's probably got part of it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to add quickly that I think when you're non-Christian, then you're outside of how you see life is different. But then you become a Christ-led. Well, the journey of life, it takes you very fast. You're here, you're there. Just from my own life, from the village, and then you come into the other city. Then you're in the city. Then there's no mom, and then you find out, oh, this lady is my sister. And then, oh, you're in America. You just see. Then you're in Michigan. This is Mina. And then fast forward. I'm friends with this lady for years, 5 years. We're just buddies, And then we decide, well, let's go to spring break. And then she's the only girl, I'm the oldest in the group. Let's fake a marriage. And let's get free tickets to go to Disney Apricot because they're saying, hey, if you're married, you can go to this thing.
So you're being cheap, were you?
We're really opening up here.
You see the hand of God in all of it, and then we say, well, Yeah, we're married, so we go and we eat. But as I look back, as you think, as I look back, I said, God's probably saying, now you're a child, you're my child. Now you got free tickets. I'm going to show you. Then fast forward, we're married, all right? And I always think about that. At that time, I said, oh man, I was probably really mad. But we got free tickets. And then how we even got to ICC, the decision, we pray about it. Okay, now our kids need to be in a place where, more youth. She takes out maybe her phone. I don't know exactly how she did it, but she's looking. But here's my point. There are a lot of, in Irvine, there's a lot of churches she could have picked. But then she picked here, and she said, I said, oh, we're going to go to church. She says, oh, there's a little church. I said, okay. And we come, and we walk in. The minute we walk in, you feel the presence of God because you see God through all of you guys, right? We felt that. My son Ian comes to her and me and said, Dad, this is the place. He never said that to me. So my point is that you see the hand of God all over. At least I take note. When we're praying, we say, man, Lord, I didn't even know this was going to line up. I did. But how you do these things. And so as children of God, we expect that He is going to do something. How? The unknown part. I think that's the excitement of living as a Christian, because you know He's on your side. You know He's going to lead you places. Maybe not what you like the first time around, but then as you just wait and be patient. I said, Lord, I trust it. Like Pastor usually preaches, I said, yeah, be patient in your life. And so just for my life and my family, God's been ever so present, every little tiny piece of things that we do. And I always say, Lord, give me discernment so I can be able to thank you for what has happened.
Yeah.
So that's,
Yep. Thanks for sharing that.